So government has proposed an increase of 8% to the minimum wage. Now, as you imagine, there's going to be a lot of reaction from various quarters. One of those is Trade Union Federation Cosatu. Let's get reaction on how Cosatu feels about this. I'm joined by Cosatu's General Secretary, Mr. Phetoe, joining us this evening. Mr. Phetoe, good to have you with us on eNCA. So 8% sounds like a lot of money, but if you do the maths, it's an increase of around 25 Rand per household. Are you happy with the proposed increase? Good evening. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, and thank you very much. Good evening to your listeners. I think the 8% is not what Cosatu has proposed. If you recall, we made a submission as Cosatu through the National Minimum Wage Commission for the increase of the CPI plus 3%, and with the engagement that has taken place at the level of the National Minimum Wage Commission meeting, we're then be able to move from 3% to 2%, which means at that time it was a CPI, it was about 7.4, 7.5% plus 2%, which will take us to 9.4 or 9.5%. And we think that it was going to make a meaningful increase to the majority of the vulnerable workers, in particular the domestic workers and farm workers who are still trapped in the poverty, who are still trapped in the poverty wages, who are still trapped in the cost of living in this country. Therefore, if 8%, as you said, it is the one that may be supported by the public, it will not make any improvement, because currently, as you know, that we have taken this is the national minimum wage in 2019, the implementation of the national minimum wage agreement. We have taken from 20 Rand per hour up to 23 Rand 69 cents last year. And we made it clear as Cosatu that is equalized to the domestic workers, if you recall properly, and the listeners, that the domestic workers were at the level of about 15 to 16 Rand per hour. So you are correct that 8% will not make any move, but we think that for the challenges that we're facing today with the economy in South Africa, if the negotiations are at 8%, it will be accepted, or it will make some improvement in the salary of the domestic and farm workers and the entire vulnerable workers.
Because you could argue as well, at 7.7%, this was the year-on-year inflation rate at the end of November 2022. If you take a look at the numbers, Mr. Phetoe, as well, electricity having gone up an average of 17%. I know there's been major adjustments there, but it's the food that I'm more interested in, an increase year-on-year of 12.4%. That's at a basic bread basket level as well. So this 8%, if it comes through, if I understand you correctly, Mr. Phetoe, it's not really an increase, it's just offsetting inflation. I mean, that's really what this is. It's just offsetting inflation, isn't it? You're not really making any more money as a domestic worker.
Exactly. You are correct that you're not making any money, but as you said, just to set up something that can move for those vulnerable workers. And as I said, as Cosatu in particular, we would love that the increase goes up to 10% for this year, so that, as we said previously, that we can then be able to move quickly to the engagement of the living wage, as we said all along about the living wage. We, and within the internal of Cosatu, we have started already with the discussion about what exactly do we mean by a living wage. So the 8%, like I said, if it goes back to the table, and we are negotiating, going back to the National Minimum Wage Commission to engage, we may look at the economy, we may look at to the CPI, and look at around whether it is acceptable or not. But from the side of the Federation, in particular Cosatu, we would love that it goes to that, what we said, CPI plus 3% or plus 2%. You are correct that is not making any major improvement to the wages of the vulnerable workers, as you pointed clearly. The cost of living, food is very high, petrol is very high, schools are going to be reopened. Those farm workers, learners are expected to go to school. Some of the school they still push that the workers or children must pay in school fees, and it's a challenge for those vulnerable workers. For the farm worker, for the domestic workers, in fact, they are earning nothing. They are earning peanuts. There are still farmers or employers who still really undermine the national minimum wage. And we would urge the Minister of Labour to lead that campaign that any employer who undermines the national minimum wage must pay. If you look at the research or the report, almost about 45% of employers are undermining or ignoring the National Minimum Wage Act, not because they are not able to afford. It's just they are ignoring, they're undermining it. Because if you are an employer and you see that you've got a proof that you cannot be able to afford, the Act does allow you to make an application for exemption, but you must also consult workers. But you are not all going to be given exemption for the whole, for an indefinite. You may be given an exemption for 6 months or 12 months. Then you must then come back. Then the Commission must then, through the Department of Labour, they would have to assess whether you now have improved your profit or not. So these employers, we think that Minister of Labour and his officials, and in particular the Department of Labour inspectors, must begin to act, and those employers must pay. That is why Cosatu and other federation and NETLEC, we are making a submission to amend the Minimum Wage Act, the National Minimum Wage Act, to make it difficult for those employers who continue to undermine, deliberately to undermine the national minimum wage.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Phetoe, just before I say goodbye to you. A last question to you. There is talks of a reshuffle. We know what's happened at the ANC elective conference. There is an expectation. Do you believe that Thulas Nxesi, as the Minister of Labour and Employment, is still the right minister to take this fight forward for you if there was a reshuffle, or do you think somebody else would do a better job at protecting the most vulnerable workers in our country?
Well, in response to that, that will be for a different engagement, not for today. I think that we have not, as Cosatu, we have not engaged ourselves in that process, and therefore I can't comment on something that is not a position of Cosatu.
But for the moment, until those conversations are had, I always appreciate your time in speaking to us. So welcoming the increase, the proposed increase, but as Mr. Phetoe and I were talking about, 8% really only offsets inflation. There's no real increase per se, not in real terms, when you see a national minimum wage, an NMW, being increased by 8% when, as Mr. Phetoe quite rightly says, inflation currently sitting at 7.7%. It's just offsetting, really, the increased cost of living. That was Cosatu General Secretary Solly Phetoe joining us here on eNCA.